Hello and welcome to the Fall of the Templars. Founded in the year 1119, 20 years after the success of the First Crusade, the Knights Templar, named so because of their headquarters on the Temple Mount, the supposed site of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, were an illustrious monastic military order spread throughout Christendom from France to the Holy Land. They are remembered primarily for their martial role in defending Christian pilgrimage sites and the outermost states, the Frankified Latin kingdoms in Syria and modern-day Palestine. Indeed, despite their representing a negligible percentage of the medieval knightly class, they are greatly overrepresented in popular perceptions of this period, perhaps as a long consequence of Walter Scott's Waverley novels and the 19th century Orientalism in general, which now manifests as a glut of fiction novels and the Assassin's Creed series. I must also admit, though, that the Walter Scott angle partly attests to this, that there is a mythologized pseudo Knights Templar that is presented as a model for the Freemasons, and this is a popular idiom that comes out of the 18th century. A secret religious society representing a state within a state. You can then retroactively claim a Templar connection to everything from the Rosicrucians to the Priory of Sion, for those of you who remember your Dan Brown novels. So moving away from the knightly ideal and the fantasies, despite the Templars' humble origins, they would emerge as great landowners in their own right. Some of the grants of Templar land would present more like noble fiefs than simple holdings. Moreover, as pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land needed security for their possessions, the Templars' role evolved into that of international bankers. However, on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, Philip IV of France, in the name of the Church Inquisition, arrested all the Templars residing in his kingdom and seized their property. They were charged with idolatry, blasphemy, sodomy. Under pain of torture, prominent Templars, including Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, and Hugh de Perrot, confessed their guilt to the Inquisition and then an assembly of Paris-educated theologians. King Philip encouraged other Christian rulers to follow suit, even the Pope, whose church authority the king had so brazenly flouted. Indeed, while the Pope reluctantly conceded to hold a council to determine the matter further, French bishops, under the king's direction, worked tirelessly in exacting further confessions to confirm the guilt of the order as a whole. Before this council finally opened in October of 1311, the French Archbishop of Sens had organized for 54 prominent Templars to be burnt at the stake for heresy outside of Paris. This act of terror stunned the remaining Templars into silence or flight. Presented with a fait accompli, the Pope, in his Vox in Excelso, acknowledged the Templars' defeat and suppressed the Templar order. This wasn't the moral condemnation the king had wanted. On the 18th of March, 1314, the Grand Master recanted his confession and was burnt at the stake, protesting his innocence. King Philip, however, would die only a few months later. How could this have happened? How could such an illustrious order meet with such a sudden and seemingly inexplicable demise? If you look at the history of the Crusades, it begins with glory. It also begins with a massacre in the year 1099, when the Crusaders take Jerusalem. Thereafter, the success of the Crusades is rather checkered. You have the Second Crusade, which involves warring sovereigns for the first time, the intervention of the King of France and the Emperor of Eastern Rome or Byzantium, but nevertheless they're unable to regain land that was lost to the emerging new Sultanate of Nur ad-Din, who would later be replaced by the Ayyubid dynasty of Salah al-Din, that being the County of Edessa. Progressively, you see a series of disasters for the Crusaders. So in the year 1186, Jerusalem is lost, and the Third Crusade, led by Philip of France and Richard the Lionheart, establishes a foothold in the Crusader states, but fails to retake Jerusalem itself. When Jerusalem is taken by the Emperor Frederick II, it's done so under very strange circumstances that see the Emperor become excommunicated and reviled for the way apparently he was able to win the city back as a result of treaty rather than conquest. You then have a series of sackings, rampaging Khwarezmians going throughout the Levant, which further undermine the role of the Crusaders there. But in 1291, following the success of this new Muslim empire, the Mamluks, Acre is lost, and with it, the last serious outpost on the eastern Mediterranean mainland in the Levant. The Hospitallers, the great competitor of the military orders to the Templars and erstwhile adversaries, relocated first to Cyprus and then were granted the Isle of Rhodes. And then after they were finally evicted from Rhodes during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, they were gone to Malta, which they would hold until Napoleon conquered the island. Then we have to think of the other military orders, like the Teutonic Order, who had a formidable redoubt at Marienburg in Prussia. If you look at these Hospitaller strongholds in Rhodes and the Teutonic Order strongpost in Marienburg, this could perhaps explain how it was so easy, relatively, for the Templars to be so systematically crushed in the way that they were by the King of France, given that there was no great Templar outpost or kingdom. That and these monastic knights never formed great establishments, monasteries of hundreds of monks. We have little more than chapter houses with a few brothers resident. They were rich in possessions, but they were ultimately small in numbers. So, for example, when it came to the trials in England, we only have 144 Templars in England as a whole, despite the inordinate amount of influence they held there. I tend to look at this as the, you can say perhaps inevitable, although I'm very much loath to use that word, result of church cohabitation with the Kingdom of France ever since Louis VIII began his intervention in the Albigensian Crusade of the 1220s. There you see the Inquisition coming into the south of France, the former county of Toulouse, in the Occitan, and beginning their persecutions against the Cathars, albeit it's interesting to note the distinction between the Cathars, which were a very distinct heretical group with Manichaean elements and things actually imported from the East, as opposed to the Crusades, who were basically tarred with the same brush, although I believe it's completely unfair to do so. So that's one element. The result of this cohabitation between France and the Church leads to a series of wars against the Hohenstaufens in Italy, resulting in the regicide of the last Hohenstaufen king and Duke of Swabia, Conradin, and the replacement of his dynasty with that of the Capetians, the same dynasty as Philip IV of France. And then after you have some very controversial episodes for the papacy, not to say that wasn't incredibly controversial, at least I certainly find it to be, you have the Aragonese Crusade, where it very much seems that the whole notion of the Crusade and the Church internally in Europe is now being serviced to the needs of the French monarchy in particular. So when finally we arrive at the beginning of the 14th century, we have the most terrifying king of France, perhaps in all of French history. And we have a series of very dramatic about turns for the Church, involving the abduction and subsequent death of a Pope, Boniface VIII, under the auspices of the great, how am I going to describe him? Enforcer of Philip IV, de Nogaret. So that is a key element where we arrive at this situation where the French monarchy would feel compelled, essentially, to go above the Pope in dissolving the Templars. It also speaks to something else, which is that the Templars and their decline could be seen as broadly symptomatic of the failure of the Crusades in general. You should also look at the Crusades not simply in terms of fighting Saracens and Muslims in Spain or in the Holy Land or in Anatolia or elsewhere, but you should also look at this as the failure of the popes to effectively harness the forces of these monastic orders to do the bidding, essentially, of Rome. Urban II convoked the First Crusade, and it was essentially a great triumph for papal power. But here, with the dissolution of the Templars, the failure of the Crusades in the Holy Land, it's also a failure of the idea that the Pope can be the temporal ruler and in many ways assume a martial role for all of Christendom. Instead, that position has been usurped by the French king. We could also say it is the end of the Golden Age. I tend to look at the 12th and the 13th centuries, not myself, but it's rather sort of firmly established, as the great period of a medieval renaissance in terms of architecture, learning, great theological scholarship, whether you're talking about Joachim of Fiore or Duns Scotus, or indeed St. Thomas Aquinas. But by the time we get to the 14th century, all of the most, you can say, grand notions of Christendom, the Crusades, the supremacy of the emperor, the supremacy of the pope, have instead devolved. You have the Avignon papacy, you have the 100 Years' War between England and France, you have the static situation of the quote-unquote Reconquista in Spain, you have the rise of the Ottomans in the East, which spells a great calamity for Christendom in general and will eventually result in the loss of Constantinople itself to the Muslims. And of course, you have the Black Death, the end of a medieval golden age. So looking at all this, there has to be speculation as for a greater cause for Templar decline. But all the points I've been referring to have been rather contextual. They haven't really related to the situation of the Templars in and of themselves. And this is because having looked at this topic, and you can almost tell that by looking at my very disparaging look at the way that so many esoteric movements were trying to appropriate the legacy of the Templars further down history, that I have a remarkably conventional view when it comes to the Templars, or at least conventional in terms of how modern historiography treats it, and that this has to be put down to a very mundane consequence. I can look at the cohabitation of France and the church and say that this is a cruel irony being inflicted on the monastic order and papal prerogatives, but really it represents nothing more than a bloody consolidation for the Capetian monarchy. If you look at Philip IV of France, I view him as a far more devastating version of Henry VIII. And not only do we see the dissolution of the holy orders, the seizing of wealth, of course, most people tend to focus on the dispossession of the Jews. I will tend to focus on acts such as the abduction and the culpability that the king had in the murder of a pope. But in this instance, in the dissolution and suppression of the Templars, Philip IV was essentially inviting all of Europe to become his accomplices in this act of suppression of a religious order under incredibly dubious circumstances and the seizure of their wealth in terms of being able to monopolize royal power. And of course, unlike Henry VIII, this is a European-sponsored movement, unlike something which is relatively localized. Indeed, if you look at this and see it as an indictment on Philip IV and his reign in particular, this has formed a popular mythology of its own. So Maurice Durand has written a series called The Accursed Kings, which were very popular a few decades ago, and they eventually spawned the impetus behind Game of Thrones. But alongside the Avignon papacy, the dissolution of the Templars, this forms a backdrop for the Tour de Nesle affair, where you have much of the moral decimation of the Capetian dynasty through a series of very dramatic exposures of royal affairs, which result in among many other things, the situation which arises at the 100 Years' War. So all of these events are basically situated with a narrative, which is to say that Philip IV, in far overreaching the aspirations for an absolute monarchy in the Middle Ages, and when I use absolute monarchy, I'm being very careful with the terms I'm using, but it actually seems to hold some weight, even though we're talking about a feudal era. Things like the Tour de Nesle affair will only confirm that the Capetian monarchy is due for a great downfall, which of course comes only a few decades later. But I want to move away from Philip IV and talk about the origins of the Templars. And Andrew Latham here has a very good explanation, essentially, for what the purpose of the military orders in Europe were during the 12th century. On the military orders, these were monastic institutions dominated by a class of lay brothers, not priests, who were barred by canon law from bearing arms and fighting. Priests would serve in the order, but not in a martial role, who were warriors dedicated to the defense of Christendom. In most respects, these differed little from the other monastic institutions that had become such a commonplace within the church. They were organized into similar monastic communities, took similar vows, followed similar rules of life, performed the same holy office, were similarly exempt from the jurisdiction of secular powers and the episcopate. And that also should be a hint as to why someone like Philip IV, and indeed much of the episcopal structures in France, would side with the monarchy in this instance. Moreover, as with non-military monastic orders, some, such as the Order of Santiago in Spain, were decidedly local, regional in scope and scale, while others, the Templars and Hospitallers, were truly centralized, translocal orders of the Church. In other words, as I mentioned earlier, they spanned across the entirety of Christendom. Where they did differ was with respect to their mission, their vocation, and the way in which they served the Church. Simply put, the primary calling of the members of the military orders was twofold: to purify themselves through the pursuit of the monastic ideal, and to purify the world by fighting the enemies of the res publica Christiana, i.e., the heathen and the heretic. The members of these orders were both knights and monks, fighting a double combat of flesh and spirit. Not only were they dedicated to defeating the enemies of the cross and Christ and defending the rights of Christians within and beyond the political reach of the Christian Commonwealth, they also believed that such a vocation was a devotional act of Christian love, equivalent to the care of the poor and the sick. For members of these orders, warfare was not a cultural imperative as it was for knights, nor a temporary act of devotion, as it was for the Crusades themselves. Crusade, crusader, to take the cross, an act of penance. For the knights is far more all-encompassing and vocational. It was a devotional way of life, typically well supported by wealthy patrons, highly disciplined, enjoying a steady stream of recruits. These orders provided the Church with a reliable and effective source of military power that it could and did use to advance its interests within the broader Christendom of the Latin Church, i.e. the Catholic Church. Needless to say, this mechanism for generating armed force was unique to the Church. Nothing like the military religious orders existed within any secular realm, hence why I refer back to the idea of the dissolution of the Templars as in being a great coup against the Church and against the papacy in general. The man most responsible for the origins of the Templars is none other than Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and he is the pivotal figure behind the great monastic revolution of the late 11th and 12th centuries. Indeed, it's part of the possibility for the Crusades were afforded by the great monastic revolution, the great institutionalizations of these monasteries all across the world, and eventually why they would serve as great victims during the Reformation several centuries later. But Andrew Holt here has a brief article referring to Bernard's role, Saint Bernard's role in the foundation of the Templars in particular. Saint Bernard, who came to prominence as the founder and abbot of the French Abbey of Clairvaux, played a major role in the representation of the Templars as an ideal model of medieval warrior. It should also be mentioned, I have already slipped into using an American pronunciation, Bernard, partly because I hear it far more often than I hear the English pronunciation, but I'll try and keep to my English pronunciation. He lent his reputation and persuasive abilities fully to the devotion of the Templars soon after their founding, that being in 1119, giving the fledgling order a major supporter who held significant influence over the 12th century European society. Saint Bernard certainly appreciated the potential for the crusading ideal to tame the sinful nature of warriors, but expressed concern over the temporary nature of the crusading vow. Once a formerly sinful knight has successfully completed his crusading vows, he usually returned with his company of old associates in Europe and once again engaged in the same type of sinful behavior, typically associated with the knightly class. Indeed, this speaks to something which made the Crusades, you can say, form such a bedrock for medieval Christendom, which is that rather than using these knights and noble feuds in order to incite warfare within Christianity, better to have all of these knights organize and defend Christianity from the so-called enemies without. However, once you have these great crusading armies, so for example, the First Crusade was actually known as the Peasants' Crusade. If I remember correctly, it began in the year 1096, and as you can probably imagine, it was born out of a huge excess of enthusiasm for the idea of reclaiming Jerusalem, but they were horribly massacred. So the next crusade is known as the Nobles' Crusade, and as you can imagine, have that highly disciplined knightly class and they were able to take Jerusalem in a stunning series of successes in the final closing years of the 11th century. However, once they had completed their penance, once they had taken the crusade, taken the cross, they returned home, which meant that the Holy Land, which in many ways you can say quite rightly it was a colonial enterprise, had simply lost its vast sources of manpower. And without a steady supply of knights, the Outremer states, Outremer, beyond the sea, in reference to the Franks who held these territories, could not stand. And so enters the need for the Knights Templar. From Berner's point of view, the problem of temporary crusading vow was addressed in the founding of the Templars in 1119 under the leadership of the inspired French nobleman Hugh de Payon. Indeed, while the formation of the Templars was partly driven by necessity, as there was a significant lack of resources in the East to maintain order, protect pilgrims, and defend Latin Christian interests, it was also partly driven, as Malcolm Barber notes, by a desire to embody the zeal of the First Crusade in a more permanent form. Indeed, Malcolm Barber is the principal source for this stream and has written many books on this topic. The apparent sincerity and commitment to ecclesiastical ideals of those earlier knights who became Templars, suggested by the wealth and status they gave up to join the poorly equipped, poorly funded order. This is the beginning. Consider the examples of Hugh de Payen, a knight from a noble family in the Champagne, and the first Grand Master of the order. Rather than living a life of relative ease as a member of the French aristocracy, Hugh instead committed himself to an alternative model of the warrior identity, the impoverished life of a Templar, owning nothing, risking his life defending pilgrims in the Holy Land. And of course, a key aspect of taking holy orders is the vow of poverty, which of course many would later use against the Templars. Hugh's earlier years as a Templar were lean ones, as the early Templars, in accordance with the monastic virtues they professed, became known for their extreme poverty. Consider the example of Hugh's friends and co-founder, Godfrey de Saint-Omer. Godfrey was also a member of a powerful noble family in northern France, who had abandoned his wealth and status to dedicate himself to the hardships and poverty of earlier Templar life. Instead, according to Templar legend, the early Templars were so poor that initially Godfrey and Hughes had only one horse to share between them, which gave rise to the famous image on the Templar seal of two men riding one horse. Hughes' assumption that such an order would be acceptable, at least to some other knights and even the church, was a reflection of a new thinking of that age. The theological underpinnings that justified the First Crusade, which allowed for the blending of pilgrimage with warfare, giving war-making knights the status of temporary ecclesiastics by virtue of their temporary vows, provided a foundation on which a new conceptual framework of the Templars, permanent monk warriors committed to monastic values, was laid. Indeed, the connection between the virtues of monasticism and the ideals of crusading was so clear-cut that Jonathan Riley Smith has argued that contemporaries regarded the armies of the First Crusade as a type of monastery on the march. As he has further noted, the founding of the Templars as warrior monks represented a natural progression by which the crusading ideal was transferred onto a different plane. From there, it should be no surprise why we see the foundation of the Hospitallers, which take their name from the great hospital in Jerusalem, albeit they would be far more prominent in the northern Crusader Principality of Antioch, compared to the possessions of the Templars in areas like the county of Tripoli and indeed the kingdom of Jerusalem itself. But this, you can probably see, forms the impetus for why the Teutonic Order would emerge in the first place. You have the great Wendish Crusades in the 12th century, which are primarily directed at the pagan Slavs on the borders of what was then the German provinces, the Holy Roman Emperor, expanding outwards. And by the beginning of the 13th century, you have a firmly entrenched position of mainly German Teutonic knights in a series of great red brick fortifications around Marienburg. So in terms of how Saint Bernard of Clairvaux saw the, and indeed praised, lauded the success of this order, this is a segment, a translation taken from his Liber ad Milites Templi de Laude Nove Milite. They, i.e. the Templars, are seen to be both more gentle than lambs, more ferocious than lions, and I almost doubt what I should prefer them to be called, namely monks or knights, unless I should call them, in fact, more suitably by both names, in whom neither is known to be lacking, neither the gentleness of the monk nor the strength of the knight. Whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. How glorious the victors who return from battle! How blessed are the martyrs who die in battle! Rejoice, courage, athlete, if you live and conquer in the Lord, but exult and glory the more if you die and are joined to the Lord. For if those are blessed who die in the Lord, how much more blessed are those who die for the Lord? Indeed, albeit you can expect St. Bernard to say that given his vested interest in promoting the Templars. You have Eschenbach's Parsifal, the Grail story, in which the Templars form a very prominent role. But we further have great adulations directed, or we can even say adorations in a truly religious sense, being directed from such medieval literary notaries such as Rutebeuf, Guillaume de Provence, Brunellus, Peter of Cluny in particular, and even from the Saracens themselves. So we have Ibn Alastair's admiration of the Templars during the, if I remember correctly, the Third Crusade, but also to a prominent figure like Jacques de Vitry. The Templars effectively were able to demonstrate decisively that it was possible to have a model of Christian virtue taking up the sword, which again would seem to completely contradict elements of Christ's teachings. He who shall live by the sword shall die by the sword. It seems that the Templars were actually defying Christ's warning in that situation. So these are the supporters of the Templars. So where do we get to see some of the rot, some of the criticism? It comes, you can say, most famously in the earlier century, in the 12th century, from William of Tyre. And I'm almost loathed to include this because if anyone has been watching my channel for a long time, you'll know that I've done a breakdown on Kingdom of Heaven, and I fancy it is, at least from a religious point of view, the most comprehensive deconstruction and annihilation of that film that probably exists on YouTube, if I'm going to puff myself up there. But of course, much of the comical attitude of the film to the Templars, which is just moustache curling villains almost literally, is a parody of William of Tyre's critique. So take it under that that bit of context, especially in terms of me putting my biases forward in terms of how I approach it. It's been smothered by more recent depictions of the Templars. There are said to have been vast possessions, both on this side of the sea and beyond. There is not a province of the Christian world today that does not bestow some part of its possessions upon these brethren, the Templars, and their property is reported to be equal to the riches of kings. For a long time they kept intact their noble purpose and carried out their profession wisely enough. At length, however, they began to neglect humility, the guardian of all virtues. They withdrew from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, from whom they had received the establishment of their order and their first privileges, and refused him the obedience which their predecessors had shown him. To the churches of God also they became very troublesome. If they drew away from their tithes and first fruits, and unjustly distributed their possessions. It's very interesting, actually, a note about that criticism from William of Tyre. William of Tyre, of course, was involved in the political disputes of the Kingdom of Jerusalem before the Third Crusade, and he was a great partisan of Raymond of Tripoli. But this whole notion that they were disassociated with the Patriarch of Jerusalem, there is an argument to be made that if they were connected to Jerusalem and the Patriarch of Jerusalem in particular, the Latin Patriarch, then the Crusaders, the Templars, would have assumed a role more similar to the aforementioned Knightly Order of Santiago, like the Reconquista spirit that you see in Spain and Iberia of the same time, that as the Templars would have so much more invested in the Holy Land, perhaps again they could have remained true to that monastic and knightly ideal simultaneously. So it's interesting that William of Tyre is noting that disassociation with them becoming more rootless, you can say in many ways, rootless cosmopolitans, that they would therefore be divorced from their original purpose. Sophia Menache, who's again all of these articles are cited in the description, then talks about this further by looking at the example of one John of Würzburg and his attitude on the Templars. Much property and countless revenues of the Templars, both in the country of France and elsewhere, were accounted for them, i.e., they were responsible for holding on to so much property throughout Europe. It gives a considerable amount of alms to the poor in Christ, but not a tenth part of that which is done by the Hospitallers. Again, you can see very early on there is this friction between the two most prominent military orders in the Holy Land. The house also has very many knights for the defence of the land of the Christians, but they had the misfortune, I know not whether truly or falsely, to have their fair fame aspersed with the reproach of treachery, which indeed was clearly proved in the well-known affair of Damascus under King Conrad. And Sophia Menache adds to this context. John alludes here to the siege of Damascus in 1148, so this during the Second Crusade. The Templars were reported to have been bribed by the Muslims to persuade Conrad III, king of the Romans, to raise the siege. The chronicle of Bernard Letoiseur repeats this charge, but accuses the Hospitallers of connivance as well. William of Tyre criticized the cupidity of certain of our nobles, although he did not explicitly refer to Templars. However, the Templars' alleged betrayal of the Crusade and the Holy Land received full attention in the writings. Reporting the capture of Ascalon, William strongly disapproved of the Templars' offensive as motivated by a lust for spoils and plunder, that being William of Tyre again. In 1154, he went so far as to accuse the knights of delivering Nasser al-Din, the son of the late Egyptian sultan, to his enemies in exchange for 60,000 gold florins, even though he was reportedly on the verge of converting to Christianity. In reporting the death of their master, Hugh de Saint-Amand, William of Tyre described him as a wicked man, haughty, arrogant, in whose nostrils dwelt the spirit of fury, one who neither feared God nor revered men. No wonder, therefore, that ultimately he was mourned by no one. This should be interesting, I think, in terms of my Aragonese comparison I'm going to bring up at the end. William of Tyre went even further, presenting the entire order as a threat to the existence of the Crusader kingdoms. In 1166, he criticized the Templars' surrender of a fortress to Shirkuh, a Muslim emir, and justified the angry response of King Aymery of Jerusalem, who put 12 Templars to death. Worse still, in 1173, he accused the Templars of lèse-majesté for having murdered the assassin's envoy, Abdallah. This misdeed threatened to bring irreparable ruin upon the kingdom. Indeed, that one note, I think, actually provided the impetus for that hanging scene you actually see in Kingdom of Heaven. But of course, if you watch that scene in the film, you'll find it's of entirely different context. I hate to bring that film up. It's just it lingers on in the mind. William of Tyre's reflections on this point merit some further consideration. The news of this atrocious deed roused the king to violent anger, almost frenzied. He summoned the barons, and declaring that the outrage amounted to injury against himself, he demanded their advice as the course of action to be adopted. The barons were of one mind that such wickedness should not be passed over, for by that crime the royal authority seemed to be put to naught, and undeserved infamy brought upon the good faith and constancy of the Christian profession. Again, interesting, this whole notion of the knightly ideal and the church usurping royal authority, as we'll later see the case in extremis and vice versa. Moreover, through this act, the church in the Orient seemed likely to lose the increase so pleasing to God that had already been prepared for it. Indeed, this is about the profusion of not just the Latin kingdoms, but the whole sort of Latin church, possibly even at the expense of the Eastern Christians that we see. Pope Innocent III, otherwise a friend of the Templars, claimed that they make a cloak of religion for worldly gain. He writes in the severest fashion about the order's misuse of its copious privileges. Following the doctrine of devils, they mark the sign of the crucified on every kind of vagabond. They think nothing of adding sin to sin like a long rope, claiming that whosoever have appealed to their brotherhood by a yearly contribution of 2 or 3 shillings cannot be lawfully deprived of the burial office of the church, even though they may be under an interdict. Again, it's very interesting that Innocent III will be making these remarks, given the fact that the end of the papacy, really of the mold he established, the hierocracy, and the end of the Templars would seem to go hand in hand. In Pope Honorius's bull, De Insolentia Templarorum Reprimanda, Pope Honorius claimed that the English Templars had abused their privileges. He accused the knights of usurping domains, preventing customary dues from being paid to the crown, disregarding the customs of the king's manners, engaging royal officers in vexatious lawsuits. At this stage, the negative image of the knights was also promoted in the popular mind. There were, for instance, the French proverbs, to drink like a Templar, to swear like a Templar, as well as the German term Tempelhaus, brothel. On that particular note, again, usurping domains, it should be noted that many of these territories weren't so much usurpation of domains, but they were granted royal fiefs. And according, again, with the rights of fiefs, they were afforded the Templars certain extra-legal rights and privileges that have some interesting connotations we'll probably get to at later. But of course, even the Pope here is saying that the possession of these fiefs isn't entirely legal in terms of the constitution of the kingdoms at that time. In other words, the Templars are exceeding the rights that have been afforded to them by the crown. If you look at someone like Innocent III and the Albigensian Crusade, it really is a fascinating contest between looking at the rights of the church, the need to crush heretics and heathens alike, but also to preserve the legally established constitutions and territories of whoever the legitimate authority is at that time. And so it would seem that throughout much of the 13th century, the good popes are involved in a deep legalistic balancing act, preventing one of these authorities from over-asserting itself and ultimately being to the detriment of broader Christendom. The most extreme example of this, of course, will probably be the Fourth Crusade. Indeed, this view is actually echoed in some more modern historiography. Stephen Runciman, I've referenced him before on this channel, is a famous Crusader historian. However, he's also known for his Byzantophilia, in that he's far more, you can say, sympathetic to the Eastern Orthodox Church and Constantinople than he is to the Latin Christians and the Crusaders. But nevertheless, this is his view. A final source of disillusion was provided by the military orders. This in terms of the diminution of a Crusader spirit in the 13th and the 14th century writ large. These great brotherhoods had been founded to represent the ideal of knights pledged to fight for the cross. They still would fight with courage and skill if fighting had to be done, but they were acquiring other interests. The Teutonic knights still kept a contingent in the Outremer, but their main attention was given to the conquest of a more easily exploitable heathen lands by the Baltic Sea. He is referring to the Balts and the Lithuanians in particular. But again, as I've been at pains to mention, looking at the Hospitallers and Rhodes and later Malta and the Teutonic knights, they would actually go off into areas like Riga and Reval, Livonia, and establish the territory of the church, the Terra Marina, by the sea in the Baltic. And again, these lands were previously heathens, not Muslims, but pagans. And they established a legacy there, especially a German legacy, an aristocratic legacy that would last up until the Russification efforts, really into the 20th century. So, but the whole point is that even though the Teutonic Order would begin to assume a political and even an ethnic, nationalistic legacy in the East, that would ensure that they had a means of survival. Indeed, the Teutonic Knights, even though dispossessed of the lands of the Teutonic Order, are still with us today. The Hospitallers and the the Templars and the Hospitallers had become the greatest landowners in the Outremer, but they even but they owned even vaster and far more profitable estates in Western Europe, whose administration occupied their abler members. They were bitterly jealous of each other, even to the extent of armed conflict. The Hospitallers were less corrupt, but they wished as far as possible to farm their huge estates in Outremer and peace. Again, there isn't going to really add a citation to that, but the whole notion of the Hospitallers being less corrupt again, you have to look at this in terms of so much vilification and propaganda is taking place against the Templars. When it comes to accounting this, the scale is perhaps again best afforded by the lands themselves. And we also have to bear in mind that a huge number of Templars weren't arrested and burnt at the stake. Many of them simply were amalgamated into the Hospitallers. So if indeed there were this institutional rot that goes to the heart of the individuals responsible, then these same individuals would later become Hospitallers in the 14th century. Just to quickly answer this question, the territory of the Teutonic Order in East Prussia secularized to become the Duchy of Prussia, but the Teutonic Order remained, and they remained Catholic, while the Prussians became Lutherans and then Calvinists. The Templars owned less land, and when I talk about assets, of course, I'm mainly referring to physical assets, wealth. Their main interest was in banking, with clients not only in the Outremer and in Western Europe, but also among the Muslims, with whom they seemed far too ready to fraternize. Again, Stephen Runciman is echoing the claim made by William of Tyre centuries before. They were moreover suspected, not without reason, of having an esoteric law, of indulging in strange and immoral practices. Recruits who joined the orders did so less from piety and zeal for a holy cause than for a desire to join in rich and splendid society, and that could be said of the church, unfortunately, writ large. When the end came and Outremer were overwhelmed by the armies of Islam, the knights fought with superb and desperate bravery, but they had already lost their public esteem. Their final gallantry could not recover it for them. Their wealth and their selfishness had made them too many enemies. The Hospitallers later redeemed their reputation by their long struggles against the Turks, first in Rhodes and later in Malta. But the Templars were soon to be savagely suppressed and their properties annexed, and their shameful fate showed how few their friends were. It should also show how little the authorities now cared about the crusade. And again, that's his final point. He's looking at this in terms of the diminution of the crusading spirit. I would argue perhaps the inverse, that the diminution of the Crusades was actually accelerated by the, in many ways, premature suppression of the Templars, because even Runciman's very cynical argumentation regarding the Templars, which is buying into this whole notion that there had to be some deep rot in order to explain the logic behind the suppression in the first place, in many ways actually giving legitimacy to Philip IV in his arguments. Had the situation been different, there was a certain possibility that the Templars could have further demonstrated, as he would refer to it, superb and desperate bravery in the face, say, for example, if they had served at, I don't know, the Crusade of Nicopolis or in defense of Constantinople in 1453, whatever. But that, again, is part of a classic argument, which really, in terms of Malcolm Barber and his particular interest in this topic, he's really interested in refuting a sort of rote assumption regarding Philip IV that carried through with either positive or negative connotations, it should be said, that the Templars were guilty of something. Indeed, when Runciman references esoteric law, it's this esoteric law that's going to be taken up by 18th and 19th century figures, even people I've read extensively like Schlegel, to try and find some common root that can link back to a history of the secret societies. Indeed, when I was talking about Joan of Arc, I was mentioning how in the 20th century, concurrently with the canonization process, there was also the attempt by Margaret Murray to present her as representing a concurrent witch cult. And indeed, the presence of pagan rituals and law, which coincides, you can say, with the mainstream Catholic Church, two traditions living in constant conflict. And you look at the Cathars, you look at this, again, very heterodox Manichaean sect operating first in the Balkans, then in areas in Germany and Cologne, then finally finding a brief refuge around the cities of Carcassonne and Toulouse and the Pyrenees. That ideology of the Cathars seems to have been extrapolated by a lot of, you can say, lazier historiography to apply to the Templars as well. And regarding Malcolm Barber, these are a few pages regarding the event itself, the Knight of Long Knives for the Order of the Templars in 1307. A bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing which is horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear, of a detestable crime, an execrable evil, an abominable work, a detestable disgrace, a thing almost inhuman, indeed set apart from all humanity. These high-flown rhetoric forms the opening of King Philip IV's secret orders to his bailli and his seneschal, in other words, his bailiffs and his seneschals, throughout France, dated the 14th of September, 1307, instructing them to make preparations for the arrest of the members of the Order of the Temple throughout the kingdom. To the king's great astonishment and horror, persons worthy in the faith, in quotes, had recounted to him the criminality of the brothers of the temple, who, entering a wolf under the appearance of a lamb, have again crucified Christ. Indeed, they have brought injuries more grave than those that he underwent on the cross. Indeed, I would think even if you were to assume and make that accusation itself, I think, would place you under the Inquisition for heresy, but all right. These men, while professing to be Christians, in fact, when they were received into the order, denied Christ 3 times and spat 3 times on his image, of course, almost as if they're trying to ritually exalt the idea of Peter's denial. Then, stripped of their secular clothing and brought naked before the senior Templar in charge of their reception, they are kissed by him on the lower spine, the navel, and finally on the mouth. And it should be mentioned that references to other parts of the body are also alluded to in many of the quote-unquote confessions. In shame of human dignity, according to the profane rite of their order. Moreover, by a vow of their profession, they are then obliged to indulge in carnal relations with other members of the order, being required without the possibility of refusal. Finally, this unclean people forsake the font of life-giving water and make offerings to the idols. Throughout the document, massive verbal onslaught is maintained. By their words and their deeds, they defile the land with their filth, remove the benefits of the dew, and infect the purity of the air. In terms of that description, there is a rather subtle but rather sort of ironic element, which is the rejection of the sacraments and the inversion of the sacraments. And if you're going to take that and say there is a kernel of truth in all of this, it's going to result in possibly the most mundane interpretation of that imaginable compared to the complete and utter sort of vitriol dedicated the Templars as being, again, guilty of the most extreme form of blasphemy. At first, the king, that being Philip IV, admitted that he had doubted the truth of these accusations because he felt that the informers of this kind and carriers of rumours, so unfortunate, might have been acting more from the malice of envy or the stirring of hatred or the roots of cupidity than from fervour of the faith, zeal for justice, or the compassion of charity. But so great was the accumulation of accusations, so probable did the arguments put forward begin to appear, that violent presumption and suspicion was aroused. The king therefore had a meeting with the Pope and took consultation with his council of prelates and barons as to the best means of finding out the truth. As a result of these discussions, reinforced by a request from William of Paris, papal inquisitor in France, who has invoked the help of our arm, the king decreed that every member of the order be held in captivity, reserved for ecclesiastical judgment, and all their goods, movable and immovable, seized and kept without being diminished in royal custody. The idea, of course, is that these assets would, of course, be returned if the Templars were exonerated. But, when pigs fly, even though it was probable that some of the knights would be found innocent and an inquiry would be to their advantage because such bad repute now adhered to them all. Philip's self-image is clear. We, who are founded by the Lord upon the watchtower of regal eminence, to defend the liberty of the faith of the Church and exert before all the desires of our spirit the augmentation of the Catholic faith. It's very interesting because I'm too cynical. I'm too cynical a reader of history that when looking at this and seeing what was the first desire, preceding the gathering of evidence and confessions, there comes the profusion of slander, which, of course, the king being of a good Christian temperament, again, you can say the most perfect idealized quality of the Christian king is that who can conceive of no wrong. And so it would no doubt be in the king's good Catholic character to not accept these accusations too willingly. Indeed, had he accepted these accusations too willingly, let alone been partly responsible for the spread of this slander, then he would no longer be this great defender of the liberty of the faith of the Church and desirous again to augment the Catholic faith in general. The king is raised further up as the Templars are brought further down in this war of propaganda. That's not also to say that I don't believe Philip IV believed this. You have to remember that the Capetian dynasty had been sanctified, literally. His grandfather, Louis IX, the great crusading king, really the last great crusading king, unless you count figures like Sigismund at the Battle of Nicopolis and John Hunyadi, had been very swiftly canonized by the church. And again, cynically, you can say partly as a political role that the French Capetian dynasty had been afforded in getting rid of the Hohenstaufens in Italy, which then carried further into the Hohenstaufen successors in Aragon. But anyway, if you are from that mindset, if you have a sainted dynasty, and you believe to be, the most Christian king, Rex Christianissimus, then no doubt I believe that Philip IV sincerely believed that he was acting to fulfill that grand desire of purifying the church and throughout the entire world. But then you combine it to his other actions and his far more mundane aspirations in terms of the consolidation of royal power in France, and it becomes very difficult again to pivot the motivations as being entirely motivated by the one or the other. If anything, such a self-aggrandizement actually helps your justification for the consolidation of royal authority. That, again, is my incredibly cynical take in reading all of this. The actual arrests of the Templars were planned as a simultaneous dawn swoop to take place in the early hours of the morning of Friday, the 30th of October. The operation, perhaps benefiting from previous seizures of this kind against the Jews and the Lombards, was successful to a high degree, given the vast problems of coordination and secrecy which were involved. Indeed, learning about this for the first time, I was again amazed to find out how efficient the operatives, the inquisitors, and the lawyers of and the bailiffs of Philip IV were in terms of being able to make this, again, my rather trite comparison to this being the medieval Knight of Long Knives, and in this case, Knight as a K. A small number of Templars did escape, 12 according to official sources, although there seems to have been at least 12 others. But only one of the escapees, Gerard de Villiers, preceptor of France, was a figure of any importance, and for some, like the knight Pierre de Bouclay, that respite was only temporary. Although he discarded the author's mantle, shaved off his beard, he was still recognized and taken into custody. So there is an element already creeping in here of cowardice. Two others, Jean de Chalais and Pierre de Maudy, who had made off together, were later apprehended, stripped of their clothes, as they had adopted disguise, and one serving brother, Renaud de Beaupillier, who had shaved off his beard and lain low in the order's preceptory at Vercourt in the Duchy of Lorraine outside of France, outside of French territory, was nevertheless eventually found, apparently some years after the arrests. The Duchy of Lorraine, for reference, was then in the boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire, who had no concerted push in terms of their implementation of the suppression, partly because the Holy Roman Empire at this time was undergoing something called the Great Interregnum, where there was virtually no centralized authority of any significance or note. Another Templar, the preceptor of Auvergne in Berblanc, was captured in England and later played a leading role in defense of the English Templars. Just to again qualify my point, this period would have a very brief ascendancy of the Emperor Henry, Henry VII, but very brief. To the point, again, he couldn't seriously enact a great reversal of the policies of his great French rival. Those who fled may have been worried about the growth of unfavorable rumors, or perhaps were frightened that crimes that they had committed or planned, crimes not necessarily connected with the French king's accusations, would be exposed. One source claims that Hugh de Chalon, the nephew of Hugh de Perrot, visitor of the order, who had deluded the royal officials, had now been a party to a plot to kill the king, although this may not have been anything more than an attempt to smear Perrot by association. Although one Templar, picked up begging in Paris in November 1309, had fled as much as 15 days before the arrests, most of the Templars seem to have been taken by surprise. For those who did escape, there seems to have been little advance or no warning. Witnesses described them as fleeing at the time of the arrests. Indeed, it's very convenient to associate the Templars by association with a plot against the king, because that would further sanctify his role, that these wicked Templars, following off on the worst accusations of treachery and deceit brought centuries before by William of Tyre, would be capable of insulting the most august Catholic sovereign of France, and thereby giving his enterprise here all the more moral legitimacy. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, had the previous day occupied a place of honour at the funeral of Catherine, the wife of Charles de Valois, the king's brother, for he had held one of the cords of the pole, while a new recruit was received as recently as 11 days before the arrests, apparently unaware of any impending catastrophe. In other words, the Templars were at the heart of French power, completely unawares of the fate that was about to befall them. And in this case, Charles de Valois would later be the progenitor of the Valois dynasty, which would contest the Hundred Years' War and rule France up until the wars of religion in the later 16th century. But that, again, is just to buttress the point I was bringing up earlier, is that so many have looked to find some deeper rot, but it really is almost a night for day dramatic fall from grace by this orchestrated, premeditated act by Philip IV, accompanying this great slander before the evidence had been compiled. Philip IV's complaints against the order, which must have been common knowledge, did not in themselves seem to have been regarded as a warning, for recruitment to the temple had by no means dried up in the months before October of 1307. When in 1310 the Templars were given the opportunity to defend themselves, several declined on the grounds that they had only been in the order a short time. 7 of them mentioned specific periods, varying from 6 months down to a month, and less so, even 2 days. In the early 14th century, no one would have disputed that the cases of heresy appertained to the Church, or that they fell under the jurisdiction of an ecclesiastical authority in one form or another, hence referencing the Cathars in the Languedoc. The motivating forces in the arrests evidently came from the French government, but in a strict sense, the action preserved forms of legality, for Philip IV had been careful to explain that he was following the just requisite of William of Paris, the Inquisitor of France, who held his authority as deputy of the Pope. However, William was a French Dominican, so closely involved with the royal power that he held the position of royal confessor. In an effort to meet the ever-growing administrative needs of the French monarchy, the Inquisition was becoming, through its leader in France, another arm of state power. In the arrest of the Templars, the Capetian monarchy, as it had done so often in the past, made strenuous efforts to retain the outward forms of legality, for its whole position rested upon such forms as expressed in the feudal structure, while nevertheless exploiting the legal processes for its own predetermined ends. And again, this is very clever. You can look at this incredibly cynically, as I have to with so much of Philip IV, and say that all of this has the appearance of arbitrary despotism, but at every instance there is a keen emphasis on forming a legal justification, even legal justification for the abduction of the Pope, such as accusing him of heresy, in which case, as we would later see with, Savonarola, using the French king against the Alexander Borgia, Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, that the King of France is the Gladius Mundi. He is the sword of the world. prepared to wreak vengeance against a despoiled and, in many cases, you can say, thoroughly debauched Catholic religious order. So again, looking into this, and I mentioned Henry VIII earlier, and it just fires off, Thomas Cromwell, the rise of these new men, these talented bourgeois lawyers, educated in Paris, who were finding an excuse to eliminate a rival power structure. And given their expertise and their efficiency, they were able to provide the king, who was in no instance here, a lawyer, with all the administrative tools for which to enact his agenda. And of course, all under the auspices of him being the most Christian of Christian kings. Then Menache, coming back to her article, talks about the Templars' administrative role. And I want to bring this up again because there has to be an explanation as to why this would occur in terms of looking at what the Templars represented politically for the French monarchy, as opposed to these charges of dubious provenance that have been brought before the king, who, of course, in terms of like a political performance, would have to be disbelieving in order to be the great Christian king who sees no wrong. So it's important, therefore, essential to go back to the banking role, the administrative role, which they had developed, especially considering the aftermath of the loss of the Kingdom of Acre in 1291 and this 20 years wilderness that the Templars were in compared to the Hospitallers, which would establish their situation in Rhodes at the beginning of the 14th century, and of course the Teutonic Order in Prussia, who were very well established. The Templars' administrative role, encountered in Europe and in the Latin East, paradoxically, in the conflict between vice and financial power, one may argue that their financial role in Christendom enhanced their political status and assured their survival. The knights' increased importance in the financial market, and mainly their significant assistance to the royal administration, brought them the support of these monarchs who benefited from their services. Thus, despite the criticism of popes and ecclesiastics as well, perhaps the disappointment of the nobility, the knights could rely on the support of Western kings. Indeed, this whole notion that they were actually protected by royal patronage. Indeed, going back to the Jewish example and the fact that the Jews had been dispossessed and would later see a whole series of expulsions, it was actually the English under King Edward that would launch one of the most, the earliest and the most long-lasting expulsions. I think it was in 1290. I might be wrong. But how, like the Templars, they received a huge amount of royal patronage and royal protection. So once the king so dramatically rescinded it, it would seem that they lost all authority, especially, again, if there were secular knights and secular nobles and church folk, and, intriguing lawyers like Nogaret, who would have it out for the Knights Templar. The royal courts marked the difference between the early criticism of the Templars and the charges of heresy that ultimately brought around the formal suppression of the order in 1312. Bear in mind that the Templars' main goal, like that of the other military orders, was to combat the infidel. Being accused of neglecting the needs of the Holy Land could have legitimized Philip the Fair's action. The fall of the Crusader kingdom of Acre in 1291 could have been further corroboration of these accusations, casting the Templars as the main perpetrators of the Christian defeat in the Holy Land. And indeed, that would be William of Tyre's accusation brought forward 100 years later. Yet research into the trial of the Templars will show that the prosecution paid little attention to the Crusade and the Templars' alleged betrayal of the Holy Land. In most instances, including those of contemporary chroniclers, the arrest of the Templars was justified on the grounds of heresy, which was a mere recitation of the Capetian court's version. Indeed, this is what I find most amusing about this whole episode, is that there were plenty of criticisms you could easily label at the Templars, especially against some of the Templars individually, as opposed to the intention by Philip IV to disparage the entire organization in principle. But it's the most ludicrous of the accusations, the ones that, again, sort of are brought down through history into sort of conspiracy theories and Freemasons, sort of esoterica, that are the ones that the Inquisition in France decided to focus on. And indeed, you can say that as we'll see with some other kings, that could afford a certain degree of plausible deniability for the French monarchy, that the French monarchy is simply being the vehicle for the Inquisition, which of course has nothing to do with the French king, it's everything to do with the Pope. But of course, really for 100 years now, ever since the crusade of Louis VIII into the Languedoc, the Inquisition had been thoroughly associated with the French monarchy. And indeed, that was in some cases a development to the delight of some of the medieval popes who believed it was only the church with the strong military backing of the crown of France that could achieve its ends. And this, you can say, is the cruel irony of this cohabitation. The 127 articles of accusation presented at the Templars' trial in France were reduced to 77 in England, but their essence remained the same. From the first royal instructions of September the 22nd, 1307, until the last trial in 1311, the most serious accusations against the Templars can be summarized as follows. New members had repudiated Christ, the Holy Virgin, and the saints during a secret ceremony. The Templars committed a variety of sacrilegious acts upon a cross, a crucifix, or an image of Christ. They kissed each other obscenely on all parts of their bodies. They encouraged and practiced sodomy. They exercised idolatry and revered an idol, in particular Baphomet. They did not believe in the sacraments. This was added in 1308. The priests of the order did not consecrate the host. And again, this sacramental aspect is ultimately the only sort of accusation that will really stick. The Grand Master and other dignitaries absolved brethren from their sins, despite the fact that many of the leaders were laymen. This is another point. The Templars sought to gain for the order by whatever means were at their disposal, whether lawful or not. Chapter meetings and receptions were held at night in secret, under a heavy guard, with only the knights present. Any member who revealed the proceedings to an outsider was punished by imprisonment or death. Again, that charge almost seems to be guilt as a result of being secret, as if secrecy in itself constitutes a crime, combined with this whole notion of their overreach. If, again, the popes and the kings are supposed to be the legal arbiters of the situation in broader Christendom, then it is the Templars who are exceeding their legal prerogatives and rights and gaining what is not rightfully theirs. Again, these would seem to be more grounded accusations compared to the more fantastical accusations. The charges of heresy brought against the Templars suggest that their negative image and the earlier criticisms played only a marginal role in the suppression of the order, and again, that's very much my view. Whatever their accuracy, the accusations against the Templars are similar to the imputations which were directed against the Pope Boniface VIII only 5 years earlier, that being primarily that he was guilty of committing heresy. This similarity is reinforced by the chronicle of Aymery de Paillac, abbot of Moissac, who blamed the Templars of lèse-majesté for supposedly plotting against the king. And again, the whole notion that it's the combination of heresy, lèse-majesté, and the plot to kill the king. It's indirectly assuming that the king is very much confirmed in all of these views as the instrument of Christ and the church militant. This underscores the original approach of the Capetian court, which based its policy on a new political premise, one which were very different from the feudal notions that were prevalent at that time. Still, in the early 14th century, the concept of lèse-majesté had not yet gained wide support, and so could not be used to legitimize royal actions against kings who enjoyed ecclesiastical immunity. Furthermore, the premature use of such arguments could harm the king's image, while the struggle against Boniface continued to cast long shadows. These considerations were behind the use of heresy charges, which proved effective a few years earlier. Again, it's interesting in terms of Philip IV being archetypal as the development of the absolute monarch, despite, again, how I'll keep emphasizing, I always use these words under advisement, that lèse-majesté, the idea of, again, going after the knights who have ecclesiastical immunity, it's about trying to make a nonsense of these strict limitations placed on royal power. I mean, if Boniface VIII, who was accused of heresy and effectively died as a result of royal abduction, if you look at all these things and you compare to like the Gregorian reforms, the investiture controversy. The whole premise of the hierocracy, which I'm going to examine in further depth next week, is that the Pope has the authority to remove kings who have erred against the will of Christ. And of course, that is very much up to interpretation, but essentially, this is done by excommunication and absolving subjects of their allegiance. And of course, being able to enforce prerogatives of the Pope, such as the appointment of bishops, which the emperors have tried to monopolize. The significance of all of this is to say that Philip IV is positioning himself above this. And in that way, he is truly, you can say, an archetypal absolute monarch. He is outwardly deferring to the norms of the separation of the church and the monarchy, yet he is already appealing to notions, the insult to majesty, the attack on the king's sacred person, that would again seem to elevate the king above the church militant, above that of the Pope. And indeed, you can say that there was no sort of hard break where we see the divine right of kings replace the notion of papal conferment or whatever. But all of the elements exist here, at least as far as I'm concerned. The king's lawyers publicized their version of the Templars' heresy and succeeded in turning public opinion in their favor. Their success is clearly reflected in contemporary sources. In reacting to the king's policy, 14th century chroniclers did not link the arrest of the knights to their alleged treason in the Holy Land, but to harm perpetrated on the most sublime Christian ethics. The contemporary mind seems to have been much more receptive to the charges of idolatry, sacrilege, sodomy, and secrecy than their past behavior. Again, it's in terms of winning the propaganda victory, if you're going to basically look at this as an onslaught of slander and how abrupt and seemingly incongruous all of these events were, is that these charges seem to have been invented, again, for the purpose of being most, again, damaging to their reputation. You don't need to confirm guilt. You simply need to associate them with the worst crimes imaginable in order to make the moral position, the reputational position of the Templars irredeemable. And it succeeded. It succeeded completely in that. It's very modern in terms of the implications of using, again, using very legalistic language in order to commit ultimately what is an assassination of character. The trial appeared to have become the work of Philip the Fair and his lawyers, the sole initiators and promoters of the suppression of the temple. Still, it should be noted that towards the 14th century, the Templars, having lost their crusading aura, had become an object of condemnation. Philip did not use the prevailing criticism of their deeds, but levelled new charges against them. This continuity calls into question the weight that could be ascribed to the Templars' treachery with respect to the Holy Lands and the Crusades. On the other hand, the similarity with Boniface's trial of heresy only 5 years earlier do not enhance the charges of heresy either. It is quite doubtful if the Templars were also a failed idea from the point of view of the Most Christian King. Without re-examining the Crusader zeal of the King of France, it would seem that Philip's approach to the Templars is better understood from the perspective of his domestic policy. It has been argued in the past that Philip the Fair was motivated by a search for sovereignty. In the words of Robert Fortier, Philip was again the French, un dévot de la religion monarchique, un fanatique du dogme de l'autorité suprême des rois de France. Basically, he was as devoted to the religion of monarchy and the fanatical dogma of the supremacy of the authority of the King of France. If you, again, look at this, and it goes into so much of my arguments of Gallicanism and how French monarchy and Gallicanism really coming out of Louis IX and his sanctification going forward, this is the beginning of French Gallicanism, something that's going to begin you can say really a war for the soul of Europe going forward up until the time of Napoleon. And I'm not really exaggerating that in terms of its significance and why I have such an interest in this period. But what does Menache mean when she talks about the failed ideal, that not being the point of view of the Rex Christianismus? Well, is that the King of France isn't so interested in denouncing the idea of the military orders. He doesn't care about saying that there is something fundamentally wrong about what the Templars represent, what Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was extolling, that they were entirely monks and they were entirely knights, and the truest and most idealized representation of what that's supposed to mean, but rather that as they had fallen from good Christian ethics, it was the duty of the most Christian king, who was the most supreme iteration and defender of those Christian ethics, that should be responsible for righting the ship of Christendom, that the knights had again failed from a purely ethical point of view, but that this wasn't some great argument against the church or the military orders, because he couldn't necessarily present it that way. Again, it was not an assassination of the very reason for the order existing, but simply trying to assassinate and defame the character of the individuals that inhabit it, and again the rituals that were supposedly associated with it, the demonic and sacrilegious rituals. And indeed, I'm not exaggerating. I've already referenced various personal affectations that the king had, but it goes on further. I have others that I'm going to read out now. So William de Plaisson, one of the defenders of King Philip, in opposition to the heresy trials of Pope Boniface, said this, and this is my rather dubious translation of the Latin. I, Philip, maintain the Catholic faith and the exceptional devotion which we bear to the sacred Roman and universal Church, our mother and the bride of all the faithful, Christ's bride, following in the footsteps of our ancestors who did not hesitate to shed their own blood for the exaltation and defense of ecclesiastical freedom and faith, desiring to serve the cause of faith and the state of the Church, and to avoid the expense of general scandal, unable to go further, under a pressing conscience, under collusion or dissimulation. And again, collusion or dissimulation, one of the great political feats of Philip is his art of dissimulation. That, of course, in lulling the Templars into a false sense of security before they were systematically rounded up and tried. Indeed, from Elizabeth Brown's Moral Imperatives and Conundrums of Conscience, she has this to say, summarizing many of the arguments that Philip the Fair said of himself. Philip was extolled as the elect instrument of divine providence, chosen because he was the most devout, most Christian, most powerful, most rich, and hence without need of the Templars' wealth. Again, that's I hate to bring this conversation down, but it's the Simpsons logic. You can give a $1 trillion bill to Mr. Burns because he's the wealthiest and therefore most trustworthy citizen. A man who pursued the accusations against the Templars meticulously for the honor of the church, whose devoted son he, of course, was. So you just find dozens of these defenses and orations in terms of the character of Philip IV. Again, he can only get away with such controversial acts, such as the abduction of a pope and the his whole sort of conduct during the Tour de Nesle affair, etc., if he was the most pious and virtuous of Christian kings. But I'm going to refer quickly back to Menache's article. Though he acknowledged the likelihood that the king could hardly read or understand his lawyers, theories of sovereignty Professor Strayer, too, emphasize Philip the Fair's unconditional identification with the sanctity of the French monarchy, which did not allow for independent or quasi-independent elements. There could be local and subordinate powers, but in the last resort, everyone had to acknowledge the supremacy of the king. Philip would attack anyone who seemed to challenge that supremacy: the Pope, the bishops, the great feudal lords, and the communes. The question of whether or not the Templars were capable of threatening royal authority, and if so, if such a policy would be at all in their interest, is irrelevant. From the point of view Philip the Fair, the Templars appeared as a threat, since they were an integral part of a feudal regime which the king and his ministers committed to undermine. In other words, a rival castle, a state within a state, a deep state, as it were. Research into the relationship between the Templars and the Capetians, however, lead to an unequivocal cooperation. Leopold de Lisle proved that the order rendered useful services to the French monarchy from the reign of Philip August until the arrest. Indeed, if you're going to situate the sort of golden era of the Capetian monarchy, it really begins with with Philip August. In other words, the Templars were instrumental in elevating the Capetians to their lofty station, which would cause Philip IV to act in such a manner. Still, between 1292 and 1295, the Templars lost their dominant position within the royal financial administration, the bulk of the treasure being transferred to the Louvre. Philip continued to employ the knight's services until the arrest. Nevertheless, on less regular financial commitments, as of late November the 6th, 1306, he authorized them to pay the wages of the soldiers who had served in Flanders, this being the Battle of the Golden Spurs, one of the great military achievements of King Philip. Good relations between king and order were further testified to by the support of Hugh de Perrot, the visitor of the temple in France, for Philip the Fair against Pope Boniface VIII. The order received retribution a year later, when Philip recognized all temporal property in France. Moreover, the treasurer of the temple in France was actually in the middle of auditing Norman domain revenues at Rouen when he was arrested. In other words, the political and financial relationship between the monarchy and the Templars was ongoing right up until the point that they were arrested, whilst also receiving a formal recognition that the territory and that the possessions of the Templars would be preserved. You can again cynically look at this and say that such an about turn, lulling the Templars into this, through this supreme art of dissimulation, would require making these false promises and then making the charges against the Templars so heinous that people would buy into them. I'm sorry again if I sound so cynical towards Philip IV. Partly because I find him significant objectively in talking about the pretensions of various French kings going forward, whether it be Louis XI or Francis I or even Louis XIV. But given his actions, there is a reason as to why there is this dark, tragic element of the Iron King bringing about the downfall of his dynasty, thematically at least, through this massive overreach. Philip's pre-1307 policy, therefore, demonstrates hardly any animosity towards the Templars, nor had the king any grounds to criticize their administration of the treasury. In these circumstances, it becomes all the more imperative to ask what factors lay behind Philip's change of heart. The royal court was, it should be noted, in the process of rationalizing government functions. This fostered what could be called a national policy, which reduced the involvement of foreigners to a minimum, hence the absolute monarchy, the centralization of the royal administration. This had already occurred under Louis IX when we talk about the centralization of royal justice. In the form of England, of course, the way Edward was able to achieve a similar policy was by assembling and properly delineating the rights of the nobles and the church. But in the case of Philip, it's a far more aggressive and you can say ambitious policy, and that was pursued by King Edward. From a financial perspective, moreover, the arrest of the Templars appears consistent with the persecution of the Italians and the Lombards, extorted in 1291, 1303, 1306, 1309, and perhaps twice more before the end of the reign. For reference, Philip IV becomes King of France in 1285, as well as with the expulsion of the Jews in 1306. In other words, the first years of the 14th century were characterized by a movement to expel foreign elements from key positions in the royal administration. The arrest of the Templars thus appear to have been consistent with Philip's aims of recovering the control of the finances countrywide. And as I'm about to explain, this actually continues into his choice of Pope. But that just sort of goes back to my rather wry comment earlier about the Philip IV's attitude towards the Templars being these rootless cosmopolitans. So it's not surprising that, as we see the burning of the Talmud with Louis IX, that it was almost as if Philip IV is wanting to see the Templars as Judaizers in order to make the accusations again more convincing. Just answering this point from ambivalent teacher. Again, to give Philip IV to present the counter-argument, the idea is kind of like Henry VIII, is that it all sort of falls under Nogaret and his ilk, rather than figures and the Inquisitor William of Paris. rather than looking at, or Thomas Cromwell in the case of England. In other words, it's these wicked advisors with their, scheming and their politicking, who are responsible for getting their hands dirty while the king is absolved of all responsibility. Um, I think there's certainly an element of truth in that. But like I said, it also serves the interests of the head of state to have a degree of plausible deniability. And this isn't true of Philip IV. This is really true of any regime, including the fellow kings who were reigning at the time of Philip IV across Europe. So this comes to the international context, and the biggest white elephant to deal with, which is Philip IV and his relationship to the popes. At the end of the 13th century, Boniface VIII, who has been mentioned repeatedly as having been guilty of, again, the abduction and the heresy trials, had published Unum Sanctum, which I've read out somewhere in the channel. I might read it out again next week because it's more pertinent there, which was, again, taking all of the arguments presented by Innocent VIII and Gregory Innocent III, sorry, and Gregory VII about papal supremacy and crystallizing them into a document. And if there was anything to, push Philip IV off his high horse, that was it, Unum Sanctum. So in the case of Boniface VIII, as a prelude to the Avignon papacy, as I mentioned, the tragedy of the papacy is that so much of church policy had fallen in line with French policy as to make the church almost helpless if the French monarchy should turn on it, which it did so dramatically. So that the abduction of Boniface VIII again would seem to herald the end of this, great period of the Guelph papacy. The French had been seen to be, supporters of the papacy and their prerogatives in Italy to such an extent, again, cruel irony, that the popes will essentially be undone and be perceived by the rest of Europe as being nothing more than captives later in the city of Avignon. And that again is confirmed by the idea that as we're seeing the heresy trials directed towards the Templars, it would seem actually that this is the easier iteration. It's much easier to go after a military order than it is to destroy the reputation of a pope. But nevertheless, that is what he also achieved. That's not to say again that Philip IV was completely sort of guilty of bad faith in this argument regarding Boniface VIII. Interesting enough, Dante places Boniface VIII in hell as one of the simoniacs, those guilty of selling off of high ecclesiastical offices. But Boniface VIII is dead, and his ultimate successor is one Clement V, a French candidate based in Bordeaux, who is the Archbishop of Bordeaux, and would spend a large amount of time in Poitiers. In the articles, there's reference to the idea that he was meeting the Pope throughout this time, especially in terms of the order of the arrest. The reason he was meeting with the Pope is that the Pope was based in France and was French. However, Clement V wasn't a complete puppet, even though he basically owed his entire situation, his election, to Philip IV's intervention, because he was in this horrific situation where he was simultaneously obliged to deny that Philip IV was acting according to his wishes, and yet he was also subject to an intense degree of royal propaganda, saying that if he did not go along, the Pope, with Philip IV, the Pope was being lax in his attitude towards the perfidious Templars. And again, this is another dramatic twist of fate, because part of the reason for the Papal Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusade in the Languedoc and the south of France was motivated by this desire that it was the secular ruler, the Count of Toulouse, that had been lax in his treatment of heretics, in this case it being Cathars. Now this is being used against the Pope. If the Pope is to be quote unquote lax against the Templars, who are now, these horrific, sodomites and idolaters, then it's incumbent upon the most Christian king to assume the authority and be the hammer of Christ, which Philip IV is not prepared, which Clement V is not prepared to do. There are other sort of elements as to why the Pope would go along with this. A historian, Thierry Ostruc, has argued that there was a very prominent flight of the Templar master of Lombardy, Giacomo de Montecuccio, and this was following the royal order of the general arrest, and that this flight basically helped confirm the guilt of the Templars, at least in the mind of the Curia, the council surrounding Clement V. But yeah, I think the reason I sort of tend to rebel against this argument is that even though in the weeks following the general arrest ordered by Philip, the Pope, again, almost as being presented with a fait accompli by the King of France, he issues a pastoralis preeminentiae, which is the confirmation of the legitimacy of Philip IV's arrests. At the beginning of this year, I went to Chinon in France, where Menache was kept and where prominent Templars received a deputation from the Pope in 1309. But there is a photograph of the quote-unquote Chinon parchment, which was discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001. And it's interesting because it actually corroborates much of Barber's thesis, even though this was written about a decade before, because the insinuation is that the Chinon parchment absolved the Templars. And the idea essentially of the Pope was, well, if the Templars themselves can't be saved due to the assassination of their character, the slander of Philip IV, they could at least be entirely and wholesalely integrated into the Knights Hospitaller. But due to the ensuing events, due to the confessions, and due to royal pressure, we have the 1312 retraction of the Chinon Parliament, of the Chinon parchment, in the papal bull of Vox in Excelso, which literally means in Latin the voice on high, which again seems rather paradoxical given whose voice are we talking about, the king's or the pope's. So under royal pressure, the bull was issued, but in again some form of saving grace, some of the temple property would also be awarded to the Hospitallers, allowing them to have some form of an afterlife under their erstwhile, again, opponents. And then, of course, around the same time, 1309, Clement V is interesting in the sense that he spends a large amount of time in the first few years of his pontificate, which, if I remember correctly, begins in 1305, wondering where to go, because Italy is very unstable. Italy will actually be invaded in 1312 by the Emperor Henry VII, as I mentioned earlier. But it was also under the control of the Colonna and the Orsini families. And so rather than leave France and enter a particularly febrile political situation in Italy, the Pope opts to stay in France. He moves first of all to Provence and then finally north of Provence to the little enclave in Avignon. From the Pope, he believed it was securing his personal security that he wasn't going to be killed. Yet, of course, it also placed him under the influence and control of the King of France. And that was very much the attitude of the time and the attitude of posterity going forwards. And indeed, contrasting this whole idea of the Pope and his need for security, we have the general fear for the Pope and another papal abduction like we saw with Boniface. This particular segment is actually taken by the writings of one Henry Ficus, who was the English procurator at the Council of Vienne. Concerning the matter of the Templars, there is great debate as to whether they ought in law to be admitted to the defence. The larger part of the prelates, indeed all of them, excepting 5 or 6 of the Council of the King of France, stand on their behalf. On account of this, the Pope is strongly moved against the prelates, the King of France more so, and he is coming in a rage with a great following. We are frightened of this action. We tremble on account of this event. It is believed that on this account there was at least to be a prorogation of the council, in case it became even worse, if the king did not have his way. In short, it is certainly hoped that the Pope will transfer himself elsewhere, especially on account of the insufficiencies of our place, that being in Vienne. Nevertheless, it is not known what he, the king, intends. Consequently, in other things with which the council is concerned, nothing is transacted. Everything remains in suspense. So as to the Council of Vienne, we have, again, this whole notion of the right to defense, or whether this council is basically nothing more than a show trial, with the accusations essentially being predetermined. And this is another segment from Barber, really summarizing an element of the prelates, again, direction and denial of the right of the Templars to have any form of defense. Some asserted that the order ought to be given a defense, nor ought so noble a member of the church to be cut off from its body without the rigor of justice and great discussion. Others took the view that the order should be destroyed without delay, since grave scandal had arisen against it throughout Christendom, especially since many errors and heresies have been found to be clearly provided against them by the proceedings and inquisitions, as well as by 2,000 witnesses. William's solution, that being William of Paris, the Grand Inquisitor, was much the same, as he suggested to Jacques Duez. The Pope should suppress the order ex officio, either through the rigor of justice or the plenitude of power, since the order has already caused the Christian name to smell among unbelievers and infidels, and has shaken some of the faithful in the stability of their faith. In other words, this simply confirms my theory and the theory of many, is that the great work of the Inquisition and the king was to slander the order so comprehensively as to make, again, an objective defense impossible. The stench is so unquenchable that it would simply serve the interests of broader Christendom to forget the whole affair and do without the Templars and accept the loss of their privileges, their persons, and their wealth to the king. The frivolous and vexatious allegations concerning a defense should be rejected, and the order's goods reserved for the Holy See. Again, the caveat is that some of the dispensations would be given ultimately to the Hospitallers, which was the case. Like I said, it wasn't, as with it was a suppression, not a condemnation, which meant the order could not be refounded, yet at the same time, it wasn't the full sort of moral castigation that the King of France would have necessarily wanted, and he couldn't grab all of the assets of the church. He had to make some compromises, not to make this argument seem that he was an autocrat in this proceedings. It was not a valid argument to assert that it was a good order at the same time of its foundation. This took no account of what had happened since. The suppression should take place without delay, in case from delay of the capricious spark of this error ignites in flames which could burn the whole world. There could be no discussion about an order which has caused so much scandal and could cause a further weakening of the church if it was allowed to exist any longer. In other words, the damage to its reputation has already been done. Let's just get rid of the whole thing and call it a day. Another sort of interesting point, which is we shouldn't take account, again, the good order of its foundations. We should simply be presented with the evil institution that it currently exists. Again, the king and the Inquisition, as was mentioned, with the whole focus on royal supremacy, there was no desire to say that the Templars had always been institutionally wicked. It was just, well, they're all sort of heretics and sodomites now, so let's just get rid of them. And indeed, in terms of the whole sort of febrile attitude, disallowing defense or discussion, contrary to the wishes of many of the prelates, one of the English observers, Walting Hemingway, described the atmosphere of the council like this: the Lord Pope sat for the purpose of judgment, and on one side was the King of France, on another was the King of Navarre, his son. And a certain cleric arose and forbade, under pain of excommunication, anyone to say a word in the council, except with the permission at the request of the Pope. In other words, there was a vow of silence which fell upon the council, basically making the whole notion of a council a nonsense, whilst the Pope was being flanked by the King of France. One interpretation is that the King of France was wanting to present himself as, the right hand, having his son, the King of Navarre, on the other, of course, is to say that, this is a triumph of the Capetian dynasty. But in reality, this is a confirmation of the Pope's submission. Vox in excelso, which I'm about to read out now, the voice on high. I emphasize again, which voice on high? And this was the final act of the suppression of the Templars. Considering, therefore, the infamy, suspicion, noisy insinuation, and the other things above which had been brought against the order, and also the secret and clandestine reception of the brothers of this order, the difference of many of these brothers from their general custom, life, and habits of the other of Christ's faithful, and that especially when receiving among the other brothers of their order, In this reception, they made those being received make profession and swear to reveal to no one the manner of the reception, nor to leave the order, as a result of which presumption evidently arose against them, considering moreover the grave scandal which has arisen from these things against the order, which it did not seem could be checked while the order remained in being, and also in danger, both to the faith and the souls, and the many horrible things that have been done by the very many of the brothers of this order, who have lapsed into the sin of wicked apostasy again against the Lord Jesus Christ himself, the crime of detestable idolatry, the execrable outrage of the Sodomites, considering also the Roman Church has sometimes caused other illustrious orders to be suppressed from causes incomparably less than those mentioned above, even without blame being attacked for brothers, not without bitterness and sadness of heart, not by way of judicial sentence, but by way of provisional apostolic ordinance, we abolish the aforesaid order of the Templars, and in its constitution, habit, and name by an irrevocable and perpetually valid decree. Hence, why it was never reformed, unlike, say, for example, the Jesuits, and we subject it to perpetual prohibition with the approval of the Holy Council, strictly forbidding anyone to presume to enter the said order in the future, or to receive or wear its habit, or to act as a Templar. I do apologize, everyone. That entire thing, which I just read out, the translation, was one sentence. So there we are. But again, the point is that if you read that and then you read the accusations that were made, the accusations rather that were heard to be sort of more objective by Philip IV, how modest the accusations are. This is referring again to a proliferation of acts committed against Christ, most again the idea of idolatry and the Sodomites being associated with elements of the order, but also the emphasis which distinguishes the order of the Templars vis-a-vis the other monastic orders, which are explicitly referenced as that of secrecy. In other words, the Pope, in terms of trying to distance himself from such grandiose moral condemnation from his the man to his flank, the King of France, is to say that they are in many ways the authors of their own demise through the emphasis on secrecy. And it's this secrecy, if anything, again, which has allowed for the legend of the Templars to endure to many of the secret societies that have claimed it as a pseudo version of it as a role model. Very less venomous in terms of the implications of the words, but the most significant part is not really the preceding argument, but the perpetual prohibition that the order will never be reconfigured. So that's France, and that's how the papacy dealt with the issue, which was, if anything, again trying to compromise and appease the King of France without conceding every point to him, which was, again, the whole tenor and approach, the moral condemnation, and the desire of the French king to seize all of the property. There was an element of compromise between the Pope and the king. But outside of France, the Capetian dynasty of Philip IV extended beyond France to include many of the prominent kingdoms of Europe. The great sort of age of the Capetian dynasty is the last decade, really before the Great Decline and the formation of the Valois dynasty. So we have the Capetian kings in Naples, and it was this French line of kings in Italy that followed the model established by Philip IV very faithfully in ensuring that the Templars were persecuted. However, in Capetian Hungary, conversely, who had a Capetian king since the beginning of the 14th century, despite Hungary possessing a Templar master of its own, the order ended up integrating peacefully with the Knights Hospitaller. Such a discrepancy between these two kingdoms of the same dynasty demonstrates that the broader European trials against the Templars were exceptionally varied. Given that the first major accusations against the Templars originated in Guyenne, in English-held Gascony in southwestern France, the new English king, Edward II, this as of the same year as the Templars were attacked, 1307, was in a very awkward position because, again, perhaps in credit to his character, considering how Edward II has been so vilified in history as this pathetic king, or perhaps again this is evidence of it. He refused to take an easy political victory and exploit the cash grab. He instead waited, Edward II, to the proper verdict by the Pope, and not to give in to slander or the rumour of infamy. The insinuation, of course, is that Philip IV had been too ready to accept rumour of infamy as a just cause. The order's relationship with England, especially with Richard the Lionheart, was legendary. It provided the crown with soldiers, often mediating disputes with France. In return, the order had lands across England, with the headquarters at the New Temple in London. They held extensive rights over legal jurisdictions and tolls with various tax exemptions, including in England a very strange right that any stray animals found in Templar land would belong to the Templars. You can almost say that this is a weird version of the sort of serfdom laws that you would have in Poland around the time of the partitions in the 18th century. But I digress. When in December of 1307, when Pastoralis Praementiae was issued and was finally received by King Edward, he would eventually order the Templars to be arrested. But in complete contrast to France, this was at first an incredibly lax affair. So prominent Templars were allowed to receive the allowances from their estates, and the Master of England, William de la More, was allowed to return to his manor before eventually being rearrested and placed in the Tower later in that year, being 1308. The Inquisition would arrive from France in 1309, where they worked in cooperation with the Bishop of London, one of the highest ranking prelates in the ecclesiastical structure in England. But this cooperation did not include torture until 1311, which was used by the inquisitors with plausible deniability for the crown. Unlike the French legal system of Philip IV, which ultimately, it should be said, based on everything I've been saying, shrouded its premeditated, predetermined outcomes behind a veneer of due process. The English system, with its jurors and demands for witnesses, trial by peers, etc., produced few significant results, as far as prosecutions were concerned, until we have the confessions of one Stephen de Stapelbrugge and Thomas de Torredebi, who had escaped Lincoln Castle, and these echoed the same accusations of the spitting on the cross, idolatry, etc. Nevertheless, the one charge against the Templars, one that was not included among the original charges, which stuck, was that the Templars believed that their master, William de la More, could offer general absolution, even if he denied it, and his death in the Tower leaves the question over his guilt in this matter uncertain. That one issue essentially being an issue of the Holy Sacraments is very interesting, because go back to the main charges directed against them, if I can find them here. Give me a second. Of course, the main charges are all focused on the obscenities, the sodomy, the idolatry, the blasphemy, the sacrilege. It's not until we have the later additional charges that we have any notion of these things that can actually be attested to by the evidence. And William de la More, again, was accused of this, but he denied it and professed his innocence, and he died in 1309 in prison, so the truth of the matter sort of never came out. That was in England. The question of the Templars in Spain, I believe, proved even more controversial. Unlike in France and England, Spain was still divided between the Christian kingdoms, that being Castile, Portugal, Navarre, and Aragon, and the Muslim Emirate of Granada. Spain was thus an active religious war zone, and the Templars performed a function there which was effectively equivalent to that they had performed in the Holy Land. In 1300, the Templars had fought against Granada and had even lost their master, Pedro de Moncada, in that battle. Moreover, the Templars had demonstrated their loyalty to the Crown of Aragon during the infamous, as far as I'm concerned, Aragonese Crusade, which pitted the Pope and King Philip III of France against the King of Aragon, Peter III. In terms of sort of my arguments regarding the cohabitation between the papacy and France, this was primarily motivated by something called the Sicilian Vespers, whereby the Kingdom of Sicily split in half. Naples stayed with the French for a while, and Sicily went to the last Hohenstaufen heir, who had married into the Aragonese royal family, and that was effectively a pretext for saying that Peter III should have a crusade directed against him. Again, I'm majorly simplifying the causes for that, but in terms of the Crusades taking on a purely dynastic dispute for the point of view of the interest, the Capetian monarchy, that's the banner instance. And really, the fact that the Templars had been loyal to the crown, holding on to such fortresses such as Roussillon, which were, a rather sort of dubious legal status because they'd been acquired quite late and were seen provisionally as once belonging to the Kingdom of France, along with Catalonia and Barcelona, it should be mentioned. That, that was an exceptional amount of partisanship for the Kingdom of Aragon by the Templars. But none of this prevented the new king, King James, from taking a far more proactive stance compared to, say, for example, Edward II, and following Philip's lead in seizing Templar castles on the border with the sort of Muslim Morisco Andalusian estates, to which the king defended his action as the most Catholic prince, and in that future we will also act in accordance with truth and justice. The Templar leadership retreated to the fortress of Miravet under the leadership of one Raymond Sagada, which effectively ensured that the castle was placed under siege by King James. Nevertheless, in return for various guarantees for their safety, the Templars were prepared to prove their innocence before trial, which they did to the Aragonese bishops with satisfaction, with a couple of rather dubious results, but by and large they were exonerated. The principal objection by Raymond Sagadier was against the French and the Pope for, again, being purportedly in captivity in Avignon. As the Aragonese monarchy was vulnerable to France and attacking Catalonia, as was seen through the Aragonese Crusade, I believe that can explain part of the king's initial response, but nevertheless, the Templars showed remarkable bravery. They stood against what they perceived to be an injustice, and they were exonerated. In Portugal and Castile, where the French had even less influence compared to somewhere like Navarre, which, as was mentioned, was actually held by a son of, I believe it was later Louis X of France. I might be wrong. The results against the Templars were effectively negligible. The Spanish example, or rather the Iberian example, is evidence of an enduring Crusader spirit that has to complicate any generalized notions of an internal decline. Decline where? So, for example, in Italy and Germany, the results dramatically vary depending on who the local ruler was and what the relationship with the church was. In Rome, now the papal states were under French influence, but you can almost say semi-anarchy because the Pope no longer resided there. The Templars made little attempt to defend themselves and made further confessions under torture to the various charges of sodomy and idolatry. So invariably, the closer you are, as we saw with Catalonia, the closer you were to the remit of the French kings, the more likely you were to be tried and put under torture and accused of these, you could say, very rote charges, as if everywhere in Europe was being responsible for the same rituals and sacrilegious practices. Indeed, having almost a pre-established series of pagan or sacrilegious rituals, the spitting on the cross, the obscene kissing, the ritualized denial of the Christ 3 times. It's very unlikely in any situation that all of these things are going to be repeated across Europe, because invariably, even with a quote-unquote translocal organization like the Templars, you're going to have massive regional variations. I mean, the way that the trials and the Templars dealt with their individual situations alone should attest to that. But take this and therefore assume that there must have been a unauthorized ritual that the Templars were responsible for committing everywhere from Spain to Cyprus. And it seems incredibly unlikely, rather than these simply being, inventions conjured up in the legal officiators of the monarchy of Philip IV, which provides a far more logical reason as to why these were the charges that were so prolific and why they stuck. and why, what was the purpose of torture other than to exact these very precise confessions. Again, I hate to sound so cynical, but this is sort of entering true conspiracy theory that the Templars all across Europe would have had to walk in lockstep in order to ensure a commonality among these rituals. Then we get to Cyprus, which is rather interesting. I mentioned the fall of the city of Accra and the last bastion of the Levant falling in 1291. But Cyprus was technically a bastion of the Crusader influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it was uniquely affected by the suppression of the Templars. The knightly orders there, of course, had more influence in Cyprus than in any other Christian principality. Indeed, the suppression took place amid a civil war on the island between then King Henry II and his brother Amalric, who the Templars had supported. But having taken the island, only now to be compelled to suppress the Templars, effectively crippled this new king, Amalric's authority, inciting a rebellion in the nobility against him and ending in Amalric's assassination and Henry's restoration with Hospitaller support, which basically meant, again, many of the Templars could fuse with the Hospitallers and Cyprus could remain an outpost for the quote-unquote Outremer, all the way up until the island was mostly annexed by the Venetians in the 15th century. So as you can see, just by the various examples I mentioned, it really is a sort of an act emanating out of the interests of a quote-unquote sovereign monarchy in France, and elsewhere in Europe, it's simply a matter of, well, the Pope has basically gone along with this, so we don't have a religious justification anymore for not suppressing the order. Now we arrive to the voice on high in 1312. So we can simply organize a restructuring. What could be more benign in somewhere like Hungary than simply taking the members of one military order and putting them into the Hospitallers, which you can say again is the best outcome for many of the Templars, unlike the horrific situation we see in France, where dozens of them were burned to the stake based on the idea that they were lapsed heretics. And that comes to a very important question, which is the question of guilt. It should be obvious to people listening that I am very, very cynical about the legitimacy of the Templars' guilt. Of course, this comes to the whole notion of the validity of confessions extracted under torture. And not only do you have the idea of torture being a effective means, again, of being able to extract truthful confessions, unlike, again, a very justified argument that people will say anything under confessions, anything their torturer wants to hear to ensure that the torture stops, which is still something, unfortunately, that continues to be implemented by some regimes. But it's not just that, it's the limited oversight of independent church authorities. So when I was talking about Joan of Arc, because, I went to see, all these things in Chinon. Of course, Chinon is also the castle where Joan of Arc was also hosted, in addition to Malay being hosted a century earlier. But Joan of Arc's trial demonstrated that a quote-unquote church militant could be subverted by the national aims of a partisan cause, that being the Lancastrians in Normandy. So, given the fact that the Inquisition was so partisan towards the French, under William of Paris, and given how the papacy was effectively cajoled into supporting what was presented to him as a fait accompli by the King of France, and that, given the Pope was so, again, under the thumb of the French, and he still, even under that situation, tried to assert some independence, again, shows how much of the independence of the papacy had been made a nonsense by that point. So the validity of confessions extracted under torture and the limitations of any independent oversight. There is also virtually no physical evidence of idolatry. We have the seizure of all of these assets, but we don't have all of these little idols of Baphomet. If you look at the Cathars and the cult of martyrdom in the only 50 years earlier, the Cathars were more than willing to martyr themselves for their again, dualistic conception of sort of Manichaeanism fused with elements of non-Trinitarian Christianity. Indeed, part of the sort of the inner core of Catharism is these people completely devoted to the mortification of the flesh, and the demiurge and things like that, to the point that they wouldn't even consume anything which had been produced by, again, coital acts. In other words, everything had to be vegan, in terms of their mortification of the flesh. You can say that that's carried over in some pseudo-religious elements today, but nevertheless, it's quite interesting. But if these Templars were idolaters and they represented this, cult, which the Masons would later claim that they did, uh, none of them ever confessed that they would be martyred for that cause. Those who were martyred essentially did so, like Malay, defending their innocence. So we don't have these little idols of Baphomet, and we don't have these great Templars, swearing that they're dying for their god or their idol or whatever he was supposed to be. And then you have the other elements, you can say, which kind of contributed, I would say, very minorly to their downfall, given that this was so much the impetus driven forward by the needs of the Capetian monarchy of Philip IV, which was the limited prospects for monastic life. There were supposed to be monks and there were supposed to be knights, but the consequence of the financial, administrative, and martial role is that in many ways they were poor monks. You can make an accusation against them that there was a poor spiritual formation compared to the theologians that were attracted to the Dominican order or the Cistercian order. And you can actually argue that there was a bit more of a rivalry between the monastic orders, in the sense that many of the Dominicans then went over to become inquisitors. But if you look at the fact that the monastic establishments were so small, there was very little oversight, and the Templars had very few priests, in contrast to the number of monks and knightly orders they have, then there was a lot of ambiguity regarding how they treated the sacraments, in particular the sacraments of confession, penance, and lay absolution, which is what affected the English master in the Temple, for example, the New Temple in London. But if you look in the grand scheme of things, the actual sort of proper enforcement of and the nature of the sacraments, in terms of them becoming standardized, have been an ongoing process throughout much of the medieval era. So this wasn't even a matter of heresy. This was, like I said, just a matter of poor spiritual formation. What we can later be basically attributed to a lack of catechesis or whatever. But again, this would imply a very much standardized, understanding of the sacraments and the nature of confession and absolution throughout medieval Europe at the time, which was certainly far in advance of where it had been centuries earlier, but not perfect. You can accuse the Templars of being responsible for that, perhaps, and in many cases they were found guilty of that. So now we come to the aftermath. I'm sorry if I'm not going to really entertain the notions of all these these accusations. I mean, ultimately, if we're talking about secret societies, witnesses with axes to grind, rumor mongering, and a convenient selection of accusations and amplification in order to achieve slander and political results, and it's very hard to take these things seriously, at least for me, especially in the lack of material evidence. So it sort of goes over to this argument regarding conspiracy theory. But what is the aftermath? What is the consequence of the end of the Templars? Well, for me, the tragedy of the Templars is that their dissolution provides the backdrop for the demise of this medieval golden age, which I referenced, where once the church, the military orders, the Franks and the Outremer, the French king, were allies and could have remained so were it not for the broader failure of this crusading spirit. And again, you can say, like Runciman, who I'm about to reference at the end, is it a matter that the Templars failed because of the failure of the crusading spirit, or the crusading spirit failed as a result of the suppression of the Templars? If you look at the Hospitallers, and to a far lesser extent the Teutonic Order, because their fate was less illustrious in the end. The Hospitallers remained that ideal. I mean, for goodness sake, Emperor Paul of Russia in 1799 decided to make himself the Grand Master of the Order. So enamored was he of the idea of the military orders in Malta that when Napoleon conquered the island en route to his expedition in Egypt, he decided to become their patron, despite not even being Catholic. So there is an alternative series of events out there where the Templars could have again exalted this idea, given a new situation. Had they, say, for example, been involved in the Crusades against the Ottoman Turks. I don't want to belabor the point too much about European history, but so much of the argument which goes along with this being an inevitable consequence has to do with the idea that the Templars were irredeemably corrupt. And if you believe in a systemic sort of counter-religion and counter-ritual, which informed the whole febrile atmosphere of the accusations, then you can damn the entire order by association. But this is the last element by Stephen Runciman I just want to read out regarding the death of the crusade. Later popes toyed with the idea of a crusade. Around about 1300, some memoranda were submitted to Pope Boniface VIII, suggesting impracticable methods for sending an army to the east, but failing to explain how the army would be recruited. It's interesting again that if there was a pope who ought to have summoned a crusade, it perhaps should have been Boniface VIII, given he was sort of the end of an era. About the same time, Pierre de Bois submitted a scheme for a crusade to Philip IV of France, showing him that it could be used as a weapon of French imperialism. But King Philip had better ideas in that line. In the 14th century, there were ardent propagandists such as Raymond Lull, Boucard, Philippe de Mézières, but they had preached to deaf audiences. A few isolated expeditions set out under romantic princes seemed old-fashioned, even to their contemporaries. Indeed, in terms of these old-fashioned notions, Philip IV using it as an argument for French imperialism, that is very much the argument I've somewhat been convinced by a much later king, Philip VIII. Sorry, not Philip VIII, Charles VIII, when he took over Naples in the Italian Wars, the beginning of the Italian Wars in 1494, that he was going to exploit a succession crisis in the Ottomans between Bayezid and Cem in order to establish a crusader presence in what used to be called the Francocratia in Greece. That's just my own sort of belief, but of course it was frustrated. So it's possible again that the French, as they had been with Louis IX, could have assumed this role again. But it's clear that perhaps again a final coup, if Philip IV was this great, most Christian king, exalted, august person, defender of the church, whatever, what better thing to do than show how depraved and useless the Templars were than by donning their mantle and leading a crusade in person yourself, as your venerated ancestor had done and had been sainted for it. But alas, that did not happen, which again just buys into my theory that this was mostly cynical. Peter I of Cyprus tried to revive the old spirit by creating his own order of chivalry, but his sack of Alexandria did more to harm Christian trade than to Muslim power. The advance of the Turks in the latter 14th and 15th centuries put Christendom on the defensive. Even so, only 2 international expeditions were launched against them. One was annihilated in Nicopolis, an equally disastrous one perished at Varna in 1444. That when the king of Hungary and Poland was killed on the battlefield. The Westerners who went to help in the last defense of Constantinople were piteously few. A little later, when Pope Pius II fondly thought that he had organized a crusade and set out a dying man to see the troops embark for Brindisi, his servants drew the curtains across the windows of his litter so that he could not see all the men dispersing homeward. Venice, for her own self-interest, kept up the war against the infidel, sometimes helped by equally interested rulers of Austria and Spain. But the King of France, whose ancestor had been the traditional patrons of the crusade, was usually the ally of the Grand Turk against his Christian cousins. Again, I find of all the great ironies, the fact that the most Christian king who was responsible for the dissolution of the Templars and the abduction of a pope, that his eventual successor, Francis I, who would again eagerly adopt these Gallican notions, which Philip had run amok with, regarding him being the greatest enforcer and law in Christendom. Could also decide to form an alliance against the Habsburgs with the Grand Turk, referring, of course, to the Ottomans. It's all very interesting. History is replete with these poetic ironies. But there we are, the end of the Templars. I'll read your super chats and answer a few questions before I go. My church history professor, this is from SBO 7343, started that another factor in Philip the Fair pursuit against the Templars is that not being able to extract from Clement V the destruction of Boniface VIII. Yes, that's certainly an argument, and that's an argument I'm going to get into when I talk about the Avignon papacy, which is it's all part of a atmosphere of fear. It wasn't enough to simply abduct a pope, but you simply need to lay on the accusations. You need to chip away at all these sources of countervailing authority. If the pope is if the memory of the pope isn't going to be completely and utterly defamed, then we have to go after another pillar of the defense of the church. We need to go after the Templars. We have decided, despite our intense collaboration with the Templars up until this point, that we can commit this great purge. And it should be another way to interpret it. It really was a purge. It was a purge of the French administration, as much as it was a religiously designed attack against the Templars as being onerous to Christian ethics. It's all very interesting. But yes, a combination of attacking your enemy on many different fronts. Common Swindler for $10. Glad to see another deep dive into weighty and intricate medieval struggles from AM. Maybe this portends Frederick II's conception of monarchy and the end of medieval Roman universalism. Maybe. Like I said, for some reason, that's a topic, Frederick II, something I'm rather intimidated to do. I don't really know why, I just am. But I have referenced it. I've referenced the cohabitation between the French monarchy and the church and the regicide of Conradin. Which, again, it seemed to be the victory of one form of Roman universalism, that being the papacy, over the other, that being the emperor. But as we see, if you make your entire sort of political vocation dependent on the will of the gladius mundi, the sword, that is the French monarchy, then of course you can be betrayed by it, which is what happened. Jojon Gogo, no. The Aragonese Crusade will probably form a backdrop to another conversation. Is not really expansive enough for me to do an entire topic on that sort of generally. Have you read Reverend Reuben Parsons' Case Against the Templars in the American Catholic Quarterly in 18... Well, of the literature I've encountered, I haven't read that in particular. What I find interesting about the literature is that, I mean, you have to look at this from the point of view of papal apologetics, which is, yes, the situation was egregious, but the order was still suppressed. And you also have to look at it from the point of view of the Catholics being ostensibly, not so much anymore, opposed to Freemasonry. So if you're going to look at the Templars and the whole trend of this conversation, a theme running through it is damnation by association. Therefore, their memory into posterity will be damned by associations which are linked to being anti-church. I know I'm being conspiratorial, but what I'm saying is it's completely logical as to why the Catholic Church will continue to make cases against the Templars up until really about 50 years ago. And the reason is because more and more evidence is being unearthed, which basically testifies to the fact that there was virtually no evidence to suggest any of this. And when you're looking at the Freemasons, it really sort of forms a part of, esoteric ephemera. Maybe because I'm so interested in looking at the meta, maybe that's part of the point. But without having read the article and speaking very, very generally, that would be my assumption as to what informs a lot of Catholic historiography up until now. JBDC for $10, thank you. Missed the first hour. But what do you think that the idea of many actions in the early 14th century were a reaction against finance strangling the economy? It's a sort of very vague insinuation. If you're going to look at the locking up of the Lombards and the Genoese, then that's certainly an argument. If you're going to look at, finance as motivating certain, horrific acts, look no further than the Venetians and the Fourth Crusade. If you're going to recast Philip IV as the defender of some sort of economic autarky, and fiscal sort of responsibility and sovereignty over France, then you can certainly describe him that way. And that's why Philip IV is such an enduring character, because he prefigures so much of French absolutism going forward. Indeed, I have a rather sort of niche argument, which is that many of the Philip IV's aims were also the aims of the French revolutionaries in 1789. They followed a similar logic regarding the nationalization of church property and severing the church's nominal, again, deference to the Pope, basically forming a schismatic Catholic church or national church within France. So, as I made the case with Gelson Gibelines last week, these things just endure in one form or another and manifest in various ways, but the motivations, the intellectual underpinning, and the history is all the same. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I will see you soon.